Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Peter Hirst, the Senior Associate Dean for Executive Education here at the MIT Sloan School. And I'm really excited to be bringing you another in our series of live interactive events with our MIT Sloan faculty. Today, we are going to be exploring the topic of impactful leadership with two colleagues who are really at the forefront of not only the theory, but also the practice of implementing and operationalizing, if you like, practices of impactful leadership. You can see on the screen here with me today, I hope, are Bridget Akinch and James Ree. Bridget and James are senior lecturers at the MIT Sloan School, but they both each have very extensive resumes that really are a fascinating journey through the question of how can we be impactful leaders in a way that, from my point of view at MIT, truly exemplifies our mission here at the Sloan School and at MIT to make a difference in the world by developing principled, innovative leaders and principled, innovative leadership. So Bridget, let me start with a brief introduction of her, and then I'll introduce James. We'll have a bit of a conversation. This is LinkedIn Live, so the idea is that this is also very interactive. Please do feel free to add questions and comments that you'd like us to try to get to during the next hour or so that we're together. And I think we're going to really have a fascinating and useful conversation today. Bridget believes in local engagement and systems change as really a fundamental way to strengthen communities. She's passionate about innovation and finding new ways to work towards solving complex social challenges. She is a tech executive in her own right before returning to MIT, where she completed our executive MBA and then subsequently embarked on this really incredible startup in the intersection between the nonprofit and for-profit space, helping companies and nonprofits come together to actually understand how to make a difference, know that they're making a difference, to know they're doing good by being good, which I think is one of her catchphrases. James is also a very seasoned executive. He was CEO, quite famously, of Ashley Stewart, a retail firm that he will talk about in a few moments, where he really engineered an incredible turnaround for that business, implementing, again, his ideas and frameworks, which are quite revolutionary about impactful leadership. Before that, and still, James is also active in private equity and investment. He describes himself as a bit of a math geek combined with leadership. I would say exemplar in terms of his approach. And so I'm just delighted. Thank you both for joining us today for this LinkedIn Live event. I've been trying not to steal any of your thunder in my introductions, because I think each of your stories are so fascinating that I just love the way that you tell them, and so I'm going to move to that now and start by perhaps asking James first. Could you just give us a little bit of a history of how you found your way to sitting on this webinar, on this LinkedIn Live event with us today? Just tell us a bit about your journey.
Well, I'll start with the ending part of the journey was that, and it always starts with it, is Bridget and I are friends. And we have our children are friends, and we've spent many a time just talking on the sidelines of various soccer and basketball games about just the future of capitalism and about the thinking that perhaps we could all do better, both as individuals, but also more importantly, from a system standpoint. As you mentioned, Peter, she and I have traversed a lot of different systems between the two of us, whether it's Silicon Valley, Wall Street, managing money, leading not-for-profits, teaching. And so we've come to a place where we, all of it has come to the fore in this class and in this webinar. So for me, for all of you, hi everyone, I'm seeing all the hellos from all these different places in the world. Yeah, I think the easiest way to describe my journey before meeting Bridget was that I'm an investor. I'm a private equity investor. I've managed close to $4 billion of capital, both in growth and distressed. But I came to the conclusion pretty quickly, again, as a former high school teacher and lawyer, that financial capital is never the only solution. In fact, its purpose and is very elusive when you're only managing financial capital. And so 8 years ago, as you mentioned, I had an epiphany, and I changed my life and decided to make social capital and things like kindness and leadership and collective thinking much more important in the pecking order of capital. And it all came to fruition when I stepped in as a first-time CEO of a business that was, frankly, the opposite of my demographic in many ways on the surface. But it was one of the most important and largest businesses for Black women that was about to be liquidated. And I had a chance, I like the word revolutionary, but it's sad that it is. I had a chance to really test new algorithms that combined financial capital, social capital, organizational theory, just future of work theories that are playing out today for 7 years. And, and I used to share that with Bridget on the sidelines of these games all of the time. So thanks for having me.
Great, thanks for being here. And Bridget, also just a fascinating journey from your prior life as a tech executive to what you're doing now. Could you just share a little bit of not only the what, but kind of the why you find yourself here now and what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as James described, we've been a part of systems, a lot of different systems over the years. And I think I would start from the system of family. Both James and I found a lot of synergy, not only in the families that we're raising, but also the families we came from, in the value of education, the value of inquiry, but also in the value of sort of the collective good, thinking about really being a voice in this ecosystem, and a voice for good. And in that way, trying to find ways where we found ourselves in a place where we had, some of the first opportunities in our family to be in a setting like an Ivy League school or a place like MIT, to really start to make changes that we saw and knew were the right things to do from a very young age, because of sort of our upbringing and families that didn't have necessarily all of those accoutrements, certainly all those brands at the disposal. And I think from my vantage point, the beauty of sort of those conversations on the sideline have sort of evolved into a course that allows us to explore models of and ideas that I think a lot of people are really challenging sort of the status quo within the companies and organizations that they lead. And so to be able to point to those, elevate those conversations is really, I think, at the heart of what this course is all about. For one of the funniest things for me was discovering that we both had, our first job was both in teaching. And so it is, I think, with that heart and mindset of sort of saying, here's some of the things we've learned, but also let's frame the conversation for how we can be students with one another, that I think we enter this space.
That's great. Next, maybe just for some further context, we're going to take a bit of a deeper dive into some of your prior experiences. The one thing that really strikes me among many about both of those stories is that not only did you start these journeys, but you really were engaging in sort of the discovery and practice of what we're now calling impactful leadership, for quite a long time. So there's certainly, a long time before, over the last year or two, this has become such an important and current topic. And so I'm just curious how you see that. You've been teaching this course in our executive MBA programs at the Sloan School. Previously, we've now launched a short non-degree executive education version of it that we're really talking about today. That might seem like it's very very topical and current and of the moment, But at the same time, this is not something that's new for either of you. So do you think the context has changed, or are these really sort of values and principles and an approach to thinking about business and leadership that really predates the current challenges?
You want me to take a crack, Bridge?
Yeah, I think that'd be great.
Yeah. I think the events of the last 15, 16 months, this existential crisis that we've all lived through, has brought to attention a lot of the things that have been stewing for the last 30, 40 years. I like to say that one of the things that you can never fight against is entropy. And in our society, we call them systems. We harness entropy with systems, whether it's a political organization or a capitalism or literally the organization of your company, the way you organize work and not work. These are all systems. And I think there are a lot of things that are happening these days that are bringing to attention, whether through wealth inequality or stock ownership inequality, racial inequality, gender inequality, that maybe some of these systems could use a little bit of a tune-up, and some of them maybe a little bit more than a tune-up, right? But maybe the right way to do things is to have knowledge of many different systems. And instead of blowing all systems up, maybe that if you contemporaneously adjusted all the systems at the same time with one button, 5%, that you could have massive change. And I think those are the type of things that we're trying to explore in this class, that where Bridget and I have exposure to a lot of systems, and that we're sort of presenting the status quo and then letting people sort of ruminate and say, does this have to be the status quo necessarily, right? Are there other ways that one could organize this bit of entropy here, a bit of entropy here? So no, I think that topics like leadership, sadly, have fallen to the wayside for a long time. It's one of the reasons why I was attracted to MIT in terms of being a school of management. It's very purposely called the School of Management, that as much as we live in a world of AI and automation and machine learning, I think we're all discovering that the essence of being human is incredibly important. And it may be the single biggest alpha over the next 10, 20, 30 years in a world of increased automation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the piece that I would add to that is that this notion of the first system that we started in looking at education, I think as a sector, I sort of entered into this work somewhat opposite of James from the standpoint of James's deep expertise in the financial world. For me, I was in the education sector. I was studying education policy, was actually on the public sector side of things. All of the work I had done was in nonprofits, and I think, and then looked and said, there's a system I don't understand, and that's this system of business. But there seems to be this intersectionality between the decisions that we make in public policy, the decisions that are governing the way that systems like our education system are, or even systems that are governing labor, access to housing, access to a fair wage. Any of these systems are deeply intertwined with systems and decisions that we're making in the private sector. And so to be able to enter that, my solution for sort of coming up to speed quickly was to try to go into consulting with the Boston Consulting Group, to try to really gather as much experience in different industries and knowledge base. But I think the other aspect of this that James just spoke about is the system of, how much technology has changed and has the opportunity to be that catalyst for systems change, as opposed to something that we might fight against it. And I think the combination of sort of technology and humanism is the same thing that James talks about when he talks about, math and kindness. It's basically a deep, deep knowledge of the systems, of the economics, of the math, of really being able to analyze deeply what that system is, where those values lie, in order to be able to surface and break that open in a way that might reimagine or innovate on the way that the system could be improved or redesigned altogether.
Yeah. One of the things, Peter, we're sort of like, just to pile onto Bridget's what she just said, is like, what is the neuroscience of accounting? right? That it's multiple systems. There is a philosophy that is in our financial statements, a philosophy of separating work and life, but those are all contrived. And I think what you're happening in the world today is that agile organizations and great organizations like Apple, they were far ahead of this. Steve Jobs was way ahead of all of this, that organizations were built on ideas fueled by people. It wasn't built on lattice matrices and lines, that it was much more circular. And so these philosophies, more organizations, and I think what you'll hear are more people in their own life, because it's applicable to your own life, to think in circles and not lines. And that is one of the goals of this class.
That's intriguing. Maybe it would help us, James, to dive a little bit into a specific example from your own history. Bridget mentioned the idea that you talk about math and kindness. When as I understood it from doing some reading, when you took the helm at Ashley Stewart, you actually had sort of one directive. And people found that quite surprising, given, as you mentioned, your background in sort of hard finance. But could you tell us a little bit about that? What was the directive, and what was the impact that you had there, and why?
Well, for the audience, I was 42 at the time, steeped in very tall buildings, managing lots of zeros of dollars, feeling much more disconnected with people, and trying to find purpose in my own life. So trying to operationalize purpose in my own life. And if you can do that, then maybe you have a better shot at operationalizing purpose in someone else's lives when you have that responsibility. Yeah, it was a business. It's sort of an extreme example. It was a demographic that sadly, gets othered a lot in this country. From a pure business standpoint, it was in really bad shape. 20-something years of operating losses, no Wi-Fi, just a picture of an existential crisis, actually. And the normal ways to approach organizational change it gets taught in a lot of other business schools, right? Of saying, this is how you change things. You come in, you do this is the way you lead. You have to say these things in this sort of tone. We did the exact opposite. So the first thing against all this bedlam of selling, shelves to make payroll, and we talked about kindness and about why organizations exist, that what was the true purpose of this company and of the people. Why are you working here? Like, why are you coming here despite all the travails that you're experiencing? Why? And we spent a lot of time exploring that why. And it was a combination of philosophy and children's books and ethics and history. And then there's the math side, right? That if we could completely change the entire organizational theory to revolve truly around the employees and customers, that what systems change would we have to say? And lo and behold, what happens, you end up doing accounting backwards. You start doing finance theory upside down, right? You start applying like future value equations to goodwill. And you do bond duration math on like inventory. And so you all of these things start coming into place. And that's why with our class, and Bridget will get into it more, day one, a lot of it is sort of the suspension of disbelief. Is let's learn it, and then let's maybe unlearn it, and let's see what happens. And when you can get into that frame of mind, and Einstein always talks about he'd rather be creative than smart. You start seeing things very clearly, and in a way that other people, they can't keep up as fast. It creates a tremendous amount of organizational agility. And that was my experience. And we did everything opposite. And, clearly there are a lot of social issues that were implicit in this story I just said, right? There's different races and genders. And what I hope is that after our class, people will also realize there'll be a self-discovery process, which is the most important thing of you. I learned a lot about myself during those 7 years, and particularly those first 6 months. and it made me a better person. It made me a better leader. And I feel like I'm living a life of purpose, whether it's in my work life or my personal life. There's no difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of what James is speaking about is exploring the givens, right? And I think that, you know, at some level, the givens on the frameworks that we talk about, oftentimes in business, those, you know, accounting, gap methodologies, those are, you know, these are the givens. And yet I think when we explore those further and really take them apart, right, into their pieces, that the givens are not always necessarily given, right? I think that they're, especially if we take creativity and innovation to it. And I think if we look at, you know, both successes and failures in unpacking those, we can get a chance to see that there are ways that the givens don't have to be the givens. And I think when it gets to something on a more personal level for all of the people, you know, that we sort of see within the companies and organizations that we're working with, and I think personally, as James was speaking, and I see it as well, this notion of we all have our own givens, right? We all have sort of our own biases that we walk in with. And I think some of that exploration of how do we also unpack that so that we are open to learning from one another, exploring, you know, sort of that path of building a better organization collectively by really harnessing you know, a power of the many, and not by, you know, assuming things. You know, really being able to explore and allow people to bring in to the conversation that wealth of knowledge, life experience, and talent. And I think oftentimes, you know, I think if you look at some of the early days of James's work with the Ashley Stewart organization, many people's, you know, bias towards that organization was not one that was associated with the numbers, with the math per se, but with some of the, you know, sort of the demographics of the organization and who, and I think that, you know, who was this community of customers and community of leaders really were. And I think for our ability to be able to operationalize purpose, it takes both that introspection of as individuals, but also that notion of being able to unpack the talents that are hidden within the organization that oftentimes maybe we don't even, you know, I think others don't see, but maybe we don't even see it in ourselves.
Yeah, that's interesting. We're getting a lot of comments on the feed about this idea that you've touched on of thinking about human capital. That's a term that's been around for decades. I think you could make an argument that it's been just that in most cases and not really taken to heart in terms of the approach that business leaders and leaders, you know, in other kinds of organizations perhaps have taken. Are we though at a, you know, really at a point of inflection here? You know, you were sharing with me earlier some recent studies and reports. One from Korn Ferry. There's another one in the last week from Microsoft that are suggesting that, you know, perhaps 40% of employees workers are going to be actively looking to leave their organization, or are right now, in fact, actively looking, and that seems to be higher than we have all experienced in the past. And that might be to some extent people reevaluating their own sort of lifestyle decisions. But it seems, particularly in the data that Korn Ferry is reporting, that a big driver is exactly what you're talking about, the sense to which people feel connected to the purpose of the organization that they're part of. So do you think that this is really, do you agree this is really a critical moment? And is there still time actually for leaders to make kind of not only course corrections, but, you know, wholesale systems corrections in many cases to be able to avoid what would be an incredible disruption of that amount of turnover?
There's always time. I mean, I know that in 2013, as bad as it seems outside in the world today, it may have been worse within the four walls of the little office that we called Ashley Stewart. So there's time. But this type of thinking requires, believe it or not, kindness requires courage. It really is the courage to think very independently, very entrepreneurially, and to be a critical thinker about everything that you've ever experienced. We're going to cover some of this, but your brain rightfully takes shortcuts and you learn patterns, and we're all creatures of patterns. Can you undo those patterns? And the first pattern you have to undo is for yourself. I know that there is time, because I'm spending a fair bit of time with some very large global organizations these days, trying to understand how to change their culture, because culture drives revenue. I mean, to give you a little bit of an example, a little sneak preview, if I said labor, usually labor, the way it's referred to, is pretty pejoratively. And why? It's because all of us are in a system where we are taught, either at business school or undergrad or at work, that labor, the minute you enter work, it's an expense. But what have I told you? That the only reason why we're expensing labor is because there's some mysterious organization called FASB that says it's an expense. What if I said that labor should be treated as capital, and that you had to account for it that way? I think that behaviors would change markedly. And so we're clearly in the middle of all of this right now with GRIN and SASB. There's a huge rethinking of what is the systems of finance and accounting? What behaviors is it inadvertently driving? And as the last I could tell, humans always author systems. There are very few systems, other than physics, Peter, I know, which you know much more than I. There are very few systems outside of the natural sciences that are not authored by people. And we will be challenging you to potentially rewrite the own systems in your own brain first in your org. So it's not too late.
Yeah.
I also just think that there's an opportunity. That question of time is a really important one. One of the things that I love about the conversations with James is that, as sort of furious and urgent as the issues may be, or as the time pressure may be associated with making change, a conversation with James, it gives you pause. It's a notion that we sort of take the time, and I think what is fun for me about this class is it's an opportunity to really take that time to be able to think through. And oftentimes we talk about this, at MIT, we talk about this oftentimes as, the work harder, work smarter trade-off associated with systems dynamics of, just sort of continuing to work harder at something necessarily doesn't get the outcomes we're looking for. And so to be able to have that moment to really pause and ask questions about the way in which there are givens within the systems that we operate in today. And I think importantly, what James was alluding to as well is this notion of stakeholders, sort of within the context of the ESG, this is the missing S, but this is something that I think companies are spending an awful lot of time, organizations, in thinking about how to engage stakeholders more meaningfully in the efficacy of the organization and the sense of purpose for that organization, whether it's figuring out ways that employees have opportunities to volunteer in their community, whether it's figuring out ways to more meaningfully engage with customers or vendors, but the stakeholders beyond, sort of a linear channel to just shareholder. And even with that question, who are our shareholders? I think that's where there's that opportunity to unpack it and in the systems level, but also to really understand through some of the examples that we get a chance to dive into, to really understand that those stakeholders come from these multiple different angles with perspectives and real assets to be brought to the table. Labor chief among them.
And for by the way, for those of you who are not particularly creative, be prepared to be challenged. Maybe we will unlock some of that latent creativity in you. There are many different ways to teach these concepts. I think a lot of the status quo tends to be with a chalkboard, lots of lines and numbers, but there are other ways, right? Some of these things are really not teachable that way, that you should be prepared for a full complement of multimedia exposure, right? To really start triggering different parts of your thinking and your brain, and maybe trigger some memories from your younger life that predate some of this hyper rational systems thinking. That maybe there's some instincts that you have that you already, this knowledge, it's wisdom you already have. Perhaps that you're suppressing it, and you've accumulated knowledge, but it's suppressing wisdom.
Great. And could you just say a bit more about, who is this for really? I mean, James, when we talk about your Ashley Stewart example that you were sitting in the CEO seat, we're all sitting in different parts of these systems as you've described. So what are the kinds of people? What roles might they be in that you hope to have in a really sort of vibrant cohort in this class?
Look, we're all leaders of ourselves first. So the answer is everybody. And business is just one medium through which to paint these lessons, which, because it's MIT and because it's with the Sloan School, it will be a lot in business. But we are leaders, and many of us lead other people at work or at home. It's people who want to come with an open mind, who really want to participate and speak and share their thoughts. As Bridget had said, it's a real collective learning experience. The real key to this class is for people to want to take down their guard a bit and to just be themselves and to teach and learn. And I think by the end of it, people will realize that as many of the lessons will be very applicable, like the accounting of your own life. Operational purpose in the way you communicate in your personal life and in your workplace, right? So it's if you're dealing with people at all in your life, this is a good class for you. And again, it's a collective experience. It's really meant to be that way. So we would encourage people who really just want to share.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think that there's obviously a grounding in theory, but the implementation in practice. And I think that as practitioners in the Sloan School, the work that we bring to this and the examples that we point to, not only from our own experience, but from those who we see as exemplars in this space, are, I think, across different sectors. One of the things that I love is to talk about that sense of purpose that we see in the non-for-profit sector. I saw some of the comments in the chat here about really, I think, not-for-profit, for-profit. I think we have a lot to learn across sectors, particularly around this sense of operationalizing purpose. And I think that the sector that I sit in today in the nonprofit world has perhaps even a leg up in doing this, doing this work of really understanding a very clear why to the work that we do. And perhaps that drives a set of change and a set of decision-making that, when you look at the balance sheet, expresses those values.
Yeah, great. And this the exec ed version of the course, which is coming up pretty soon, June 28th to 30th. That's a much shorter period of time than you have when you teach the version of this course, as part of a degree program. So perhaps Bridget, you could just say a bit more about how on earth can you? It seems like an awful lot to achieve in a very short period of time. So perhaps you could share with us a little bit more about what approach you take to teaching this exec ed version of the class. What are the kind of key ideas and takeaways and value that people will get from it? How on earth do you achieve that in such a short time? And it's a very select class, but there are still some spaces available. So if there are people listening that are thinking about it, what do they need to know that would help them understand what this experience is going to be like?
Yeah. So as you said, Peter, it's 3 days. So we've structured the days around three sort of grounding principles. The first day focused on perspective. And with that, we decompose the systems that we want to take a look at relative to both sort of getting to know one another on a personal level, the perspective that individuals bring to the class. And I think this is where having, our goal to have a small cohort as we pilot this is because we want to be able to have a personal connection to those that we'll be working with and gathering some insights from as well. The second part of that perspective game is to actually decompose a set of the systems that we use in business every day. So let's look at how it is that we look at human capital. Let's look at accounting. Let's look at finance. Let's look at marketing. And let's think about what it is that we need to know. So do some of that mini MBA work of taking what it is that we know and then what it is that might be explored as to places where those givens can be further probed and pushed. And then we push those on day 2 and in a set of sessions around practice. So let's look at examples both of successes and failures where putting things into practice worked differently. Let's learn from those experiences. Those will be a set of examples across different sectors, from manufacturing to retail to nonprofit. So we'll look at different examples. And then on the third day, really a focus on purpose, this is the day where I think we will have the cohort be a lot more of the instructors in this way, really allowing ourselves to learn from one another in exploring purpose and how we operationalize it within our own spheres.
And then the meta of all of that on the journey, I think the first day, it's a journey. So the first day, some attendees may feel some gentle discomfort, right? Just sort of saying, and I've taught this class in other settings where it's nicknamed Money, Life, and Joy. Sometimes people get a little bit emotional about things when you start seeing things in a different way. And it often brings up, I always thought I was told that's the way. And maybe that's not the way. Maybe that's why I'm not that happy at work or at home, or there's more to me, or there's more to this brand, there's more to this organization. And then by the end of it, it's a bit of the meta of it is it's a bit of a day 3. It's like once you have the lens of infinite possibilities and you have the tools to actually implement them, what are you going to do? What are you going to change? Because I think the other meta conclusion of the class, it's about change, right? Change to you, change to your mindset, change on how you're accounting for success at work, change for how you're accounting for success in your life. And I think most importantly, change for how you are holding yourself accountable for making change on behalf of others. It's change. And then lastly, I think we hope that you'll feel much stronger and much more confident, one, about having fellows from this class to sort of keep in touch with, but that you'll learn about leadership, not in this sort of way, but it's 15 hours of just, you soak in leadership. You don't get spoon-fed leadership. It has to sort of soak. So those are sort of the 3 metas, right? It's a spiritual journey, change, leadership. So yes, there is a lot in 15 hours, but I think it's best to describe this as an experience rather than as a class.
Got it. What are some things that, as you would say, this class is not? I mean, you've talked about in your stories some things like about your background in private equity, for example. So if people are now perhaps worrying that they may not really come with the experience or the perspective from the ultra quant background, for example, could you just flesh out a little bit what things might people be concerned about, but in fact the class isn't about that?
I want everyone to not. Bridget and I, we've taught various sections of this class, a lot of it together, as you know, in the MBA class, and then some of it separately in our different settings. This class is not, we're not doing Black-Scholes theory. This is not some wonky, boring accounting class where you're saying you don't know what a debit and credit is. It's, if you don't know accounting and if you don't know marketing and you don't know finance, perfect. Because you're actually going to learn it in a very deconstructed, simple way, correctly. Actually, instead of the unlearning, we're just going to show it to you. And day one, a lot of it, we're going to be talking about this little cute 10-year-old's lemonade stand. So I want everyone to know, if you feel intimidated by any of the content, please don't. And not to sort of diminish what we're teaching, which is the danger about what I'm about to say. I have taught some of this to middle school kids who have zero exposure to private equity, zero exposure to finance theory. And they're like, oh, okay. So these lessons are lessons that they're simple. The application of it is hard. And that's the adult part, right? Like, how do you now take these tools and how do you use them wisely? How do you maximize value, not just for shareholders, but for all, right? And it's not a lesson. This is not you're not going to hear Bridget and I lecturing, and it's not a lesson on right and wrong, or just it's really encouraging to find some right and wrong yourself, actually, and to really think about others' right and wrong. And this is not a prescriptive formula for happiness or success. Like, I think these are going to be really tools for you to find them in your own way, with some gentle nudging from your fellow classmates.
Yeah, I think that I would go back to something that James talked about earlier. This is not boxes and lines. And so one of the pieces that we look for is the integration of different, life experience, work experience into this work of leadership. And I think that there is this notion of fluidity and circles that we look to achieve. I'd seen somebody had written into the chat this notion that there isn't a personal self and a work self. Well, there wasn't before, and there certainly in COVID really hasn't been, right? I think we've had to bring our whole lives, and our whole lives have had to come along for the journey with work. And I think, women have acutely felt this. And I think that the notion of being able to bring those experiences that we have across from personal to work, life experiences, that is the value that we find in being able to lead with authenticity, and being able to lead, as James talked about, from the arena, like the folks that have actually been in the midst of it. If you're in the midst of it, right, you're in the organization that you want to change, or you're in the midst of the fight that you want to elevate. You see the needle that you want to move. That's the piece. I think that there's a bias towards action in the way that the class is designed, and in the way that we hope the experience will be had.
So with that bias towards action, of course, we always talk about from idea to impact at the Sloan School. And Bridget, another part of your life is devoted to helping businesses and other organizations actually truly understand and improve their impact. For someone who's wondering, this sounds great to me. I want to come, but how do I persuade my boss or my board or my team that this is going to be time well spent, especially with everything going on? What are some of the ways of thinking about, to go back to sort of James's PE days, sort of ROI kind of ways of thinking about spending time in a program like this?
James, do you want to do the ROI piece, or do you?
Look, I mean, ROI, I love my time in PE, but ROI in PE is just return on invested financial capital, right? Not human capital. And I think that the ROI here, it's a lot of the themes of this, and you can see by the way Bridget and I sort of talk, it's like slow down. And so what we're hopeful is that instead of, a lot of people do this, organizations do this, particularly when things are difficult, you just start doing things faster and more, work harder, more output, productivity more, and they measure the wrong things. Counterintuitively, right now in this world, you have to move incredibly slowly and think, because the world that is already here, by the way, but we should be spending more time thinking with the right mindset about what the world will be like in 10 years. And what you're going to find, instead of arguing about A or B, the answer is G. It's not A or B, it's G. That to me, I've been CEO, I've led organizations. If someone came to me and said, listen, I want you to make an investment in me, to make a long-term investment in strategic positioning of this brand, company, organization for what will be, not is what it already is. I hope that your leadership would say, geez, let's make that investment. I think the ROI on the tuition, I think that you will be very happy with it, very pleased with it.
I would just add that I think that when we, when I first asked James to come and begin to teach with us in the executive MBA class with our Leading with Impact, it was somewhat surprising to I think our students in the executive program to sort of find that the circle and experiences that James was bringing was not just sort of linearly, oh, this is retail, oh, this is private equity. James's experience in working on advancing Black pathways, conscious capitalism, these boards have given, I think, a lens into a lot of different industries and a lot of different inquiry into the work of operationalizing purpose across different sectors. And I think from my perspective, the access point for a really good class is to be able to foster that dialogue across those different sectors and those pieces of intersection.
Yeah, the work Bridget's doing in her position as CEO of Building Impact, it's more of the innovative companies that are approaching her and saying, how do we engage with our people, internally and externally, differently? It's the most innovative companies that are doing that. And the companies that I'm working with are generally the most innovative companies, because they realize that there's one thing to innovate your product, like the physical product that consumers are buying, but they're realizing two things. One, is there really a difference between employee and consumer? Same person, right? And two is like, how do we innovate the product that is actually harder to innovate on, which is the things you cannot see. It's your organization, it's your culture, it's your people. How do you innovate that? So that's the other answer for those of you who are sort of saying, it is the most innovative companies that are sending their leaders, their future leaders. A lot of them tend to be sort of like future leaders too, saying, okay, you have less bias and calcified knowledge built up. Go and do something different. Have an experience that's different, that comes back. It's a little bit mind bending, and then come tell us, come apply.
That's great. I'm just looking at some of the comments in the chat as well. There is this continuing theme of really supporting the idea that you're talking about human capital and where that metaphor actually takes us in terms of, do we invest in that capital and it becomes an asset that increases in value, or if we underinvest in it or neglect it, it might actually be a capital expense, but one that actually depreciates in value. So I think what you're saying there about investing your time and a little bit of perhaps money in terms of your own development is really taking that to heart for yourself. I think, James, you said earlier on that this starts with yourself and discovering and knowing yourself and your own purpose. And James, you also mentioned that you're working with a lot of large companies now that, especially recently, have really been seeking out sort of your experience and wanting to spend time with you. What are some of the kinds of things that you're doing in addition to this course for outreach? I heard possibility maybe a book, even some talk of a movie. Could you say a bit more about sort of just the breadth of the outreach that you have?
Well, the boards that I've joined are boards that I wanted to be very careful. They're industry boards of like 2,500, 3,000 CEOs. So I sit on the boards, for those listening, with a lot of your CEOs about its future of commerce, future of society type boards. That's one thing. The second thing is yeah, I've been working with individual companies. I saw some comments about how do you feel McKinsey would approach this. I without naming names, but I've been spending a lot of time with training your trainers. Let's just call it that way, right? Just the different math and schema for organizational change. And a lot of the questions I get asked is, how do you define market share? Like when my comment about product of people, are employees different than consumers? Like marketing, we expense, and we generally view that as outward facing. Labor, we generally expense, and it's done inward facing. But what if I told you that again, you're just being told that? That's not true. And if it's not true, and you had a different set of accounting, how would you behave differently? If I told you that marketing was internal and that labor was external, how would you change your ops? And that's for you to decide after hearing it and saying, huh. And I want you to know that those are the things that we did together, me and predominantly a group of Black women did together. We literally changed the org and accounting and systems upside down to take a company that was just not well into something where we were keynoting like the largest tech conferences in the country. Quickly. Like the change happened very quickly, but the feeling of the change was very slow. It felt like you were in the Matrix with Keanu Reeves dodging the bullets. A change well done is not abrupt and violent. Change that sticks, it comes from within. And so it sounds a little bit like I'm a rabbi, a bit like sort of soothsaying, but there is a bit like, what is leadership? Like at the end, after 3 days, you may decide, maybe what I'm learning in the movies about leadership, maybe that's not right. Maybe I'm more of a leader than anyone's given me credit for, right? Maybe I have it in me, and that I should do a better job just being me and letting people hear it. And that's something that we'll work on together too. It's just, maybe there are ways we can sort of, and your classmates suggest about being heard better, not necessarily changing who you are, right? So those are some things we'll cover too.
Yeah, and I would just add to James's piece. I've seen some of the questions in the chat associated with being on boards, not only boards of the industry boards that James was speaking about, but nonprofit boards, for-profit boards. The idea of leadership that extends to implementing change that is, not necessarily just in a direct context of these people, report to me, but how can you influence change within community organizations by being an agent of and an asset to organizations that are on the ground doing that work? And I think, as James talked about, he spent a lot of time thinking about which organizations he wants to be doing that work with in the context of thinking about the impact that can be had in that way. And I think similarly, we want to think about, imagine the possibility that this, cohort from this class, like, the cohorts that we see graduating from the Leading with Impact program, go off and each within their own communities find ways to implement change. I think that one of the most rewarding things about this class is being able to pull people back in, and get the report, get the email 3 months later, like you wouldn't believe what's already happened. And I think that, we'll be very concrete about having a 30, 60, and 90-day plan coming out of this class for implementing a specific area of change within the realm that you would want to choose.
That's great. Maybe just to turn the lens back once again on the two of you with sort of that in mind. I think you both in sort of your latest ventures, or doing some version of that. James, you've got Red Helicopter, and Bridget, we've also mentioned a couple of times building impact, but perhaps you could each, as we're drawing to a close, say a bit more about your own current experience, what you're trying to achieve with those enterprises, and what have you learned most recently? Because clearly you are both continuously learning and adapting as well.
Yeah, Red Helicopter is everything that we just talked about for the last 15 minutes. It's a community of change, of leaders that combines one part money, one part intellectual capital, one part social capital. And how it's manifesting is, clearly it's MIT academia is very important, right? So it's training, as Bridget was saying, it's creating future leaders and change agents, and then providing a community for them to support each other. Because sometimes, we all know this, life, but particularly leadership, can be lonely, right? To take a point of view that is not mainstream, that's different. It is lonely. And over the last few years, Bridget, and that was nice enough to invite me to something that she'd already been building. Every year, there's a broader and broader community now of leaders that Bridget and I are collectively touching, that can learn these lessons and support each other. And then the other thing I'm spending a lot of time on too is, it's embarrassing a little bit, but Peter, you mentioned the sort of more public speaking stuff. I am writing a couple books. I do have Hollywood representation. That is a true statement. And I'm going to be doing a global TED Talk at the end of September about a lot of these theories, about, is this true? Like, maybe there is a better way, right? And I can't get too much into the details, but a lot of it we'll be covering in our class. But that's my hope, right? The hope is to create, we don't have a lot of choices in time. There is an urgency to some of this that's going on environmentally and societally. We're all collectively better than this. I think that one of the things, though, that's important, it's not just a feeling of being better. You do have to have certain hard skills too, right? And those hard skills are what we're covering in this class. They'll give you exposure to a breadth of them, but at the same time, asking you to wield them maybe this way rather than this way, and suggesting and saying, maybe there are two different ways that you could wield the same weapon.
Great, that's helpful. And Bridget?
Yeah, I mean, I would add to, I think that as James spoke about before, this notion of leadership being courageous. I think that there are leaders that we can look at within these different sectors and in the examples. I get to see them every day in the work that I see in the nonprofit sector of those that are on front lines in implementing change, but oftentimes the systems that we have that are set up within to truly revolutionize, to truly take on some of these complex social challenges don't require sort of a relegation of responsibility to a nonprofit or to a public policy but actually an integration of what we can do. And I think that this generation of developing leaders, of emerging leaders, are the ones that are most challenging organizations to say, both as leaders within their companies, but also as consumers, to say change is possible, but change is needed. And I think when you see that kind of activism within this generation of emerging leaders, to be able to harness some of that in ways that and equip them with some of those lessons and point to exemplars of courageous leadership in implementing change. I think what we're not looking for out of this course is perfection. I think that what we're looking for is courage in piloting something that's new. And I think that notion is a really important notion, and one that is a journey that, I think that, Clay Christensen often spoke about this in terms of, the direction of, sort of the meaning and purpose in life. And being that we're sometimes in that mode of thinking that it's just another credential, another thing, and then we'll start to make change. This sort of says, we're ready. And we've got to start. And I think, thinking taking the time to pause and really think about where to apply that work and apply that effort. But then let's just go. And I think to be able to see that happen in the examples that we'll speak about in this class, and I think certainly James is an example of that. Let's go.
Well, you're going to be stuck with us. I think that's the other thing I would say. I know Bridget, I know me, is that this is not we don't have transactional lives. So please come, sign, and spend 15 hours with us. But then for good or for bad, you're stuck with us. Like, you're stuck with us. And we're going to really, we're building community here. And so you'll be stuck with us.
Well, thank you, James, and thank you, Bridget, for being so generous with your time. We've just spent an hour together now, and looking at the comments, and from my personal perspective, as is always the case when I spend time with you, we've already learned a lot and been inspired. I'm very fortunate to have got to spend more than an hour with you already in other fora. But for folk who are watching or tuning in, just imagine if instead of an hour with James and Bridget, you were to spend 15 hours with them, what kind of impact that will have, not only on you as a person and as a human being, but on your team, on your organization, and on the world. And that, to me, is really the essence of why we're here ultimately at MIT. So thank you, James, and thank you, Bridget, for really sharing these inspiring and profound ideas with us. I hope that a few more people that were tuning in today will be moved to come and spend some more time with you later this month. And as you heard from James, you'd better jump on this opportunity, because he's about to be swallowed up by Hollywood, it sounds like. So we better make the most of the time he's spending with us now. So on behalf of everybody that's tuned in today, thank you so much, James and Bridget. On behalf of all of you that have been listening and posting your own thoughts and ideas and questions, we really appreciate your engagement as well. That's what this is all about. This hour, unfortunately, is up, but you know what to do if you'd like to spend some more time with James and Bridget. And of course, keep an eye out for future LinkedIn Live and webinar events from MIT Sloan Executive Education. With that, I'm afraid I need to draw things to a close. But once again, thank you, James. Thank you, Bridget. This has been just fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Everyone.